June 16, 1943. Port Moresby, New Guinea. Morning heat ripples across the airfield as crews move between rows of B-17s, checking fuel lines, loading ammunition, and preparing for another day of danger over the Pacific. At the far edge of the runway, away from the bustle, sits the bomber no one volunteers for. B-17 number 41 to 2666. The men call it Old 666, and they talk about it the way sailors speak of haunted ships. The aircraft's skin is a patchwork of scars. Shrapnel holes, mismatched aluminum panels, crude repairs. It has come back damaged from almost every mission it has flown. Mechanics have stripped parts from it again and again. Eventually, the squadron left it at the runway's end, half abandoned, good only for cannibalization. But Captain Jay Zeamer Jr. sees potential where others see superstition. Zeamer has already earned a reputation as the pilot who takes the missions no one wants. Reckless to some, relentlessly determined to others. When he noticed Old 666 sitting unused, he convinced his closest crewmen to rebuild it from the ground up. Together, they tore out nearly 2,000 pounds of unnecessary equipment, reinforced weak points, and added an unprecedented 19.50 caliber machine guns, turning the bomber into a flying fortress in the most literal sense. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't even officially approved, but it was theirs. Now, Zeamer and his crew faced the assignment everyone else refused. A solo 1,200-mile photo reconnaissance run to Bougainville, deep inside Japanese territory. Command considers it suicidal. No faillite escort. No backup. 600 miles from friendly airspace. Yet, Zeamer's crew has already made their decision. Old 666 will fly. What awaits them over Bougainville will redefine bomber survival in the Pacific. Orders for the Bougainville reconnaissance mission circulated through the 65th Bombardment Squadron for days, but every pilot who read the briefing declined it. The target lay deep in enemy territory, far beyond the range of Allied fighters. Photographing the new Japanese airfields required flying straight over them at low altitude, slow enough for the cameras to capture detailed images. It was the kind of assignment designed for a full squadron with escort fighters, not a single bomber. This wasn't a strike. There would be no diversionary attacks, no covering formation, no chance to hide in the clouds. The route was a straight line into the heart of enemy airspace. Command officers warned that the Japanese would respond aggressively. Bougainville's airfields were among the most heavily defended in the Solomons. But Zeamer's crew, hearing the refusals pile up, understood what accepting the mission meant. They were a hand-picked group. Volunteers, gunners, and mechanics who had rebuilt Old 666 with their own hands. They trusted the aircraft because they knew every bolt, every patched panel, every gun mount. And they trusted each other even more. Zeamer read through the mission profile one last time. A pre-dawn takeoff, a long climb over open ocean, and a final approach to Bougainville just after sunrise. If they could make it to the island, they would fly a single circular pass around the Japanese airstrip, keeping the cameras locked on the ground below. The challenge wouldn't be photographing the target. It would be surviving the hour after. At least a dozen Zero fighters were believed to be stationed there. Others could be scrambled from nearby bases. Once intercepted, Old 666 would be alone. No reinforcements. No formation to hide in. Just 9 men behind 19 guns, holding off attackers until the bomber could limp back south over hundreds of miles of ocean. Still, Zeamer signed the mission report without hesitation. His crew followed with equal certainty. This was their bomber, their work, their fight, and at dawn, they would begin the longest day of their lives. The sky over Port Moresby was still a deep, muted blue when the crew gathered around Old 666 for final checks. Sweat already clung to their shirts despite the early hour. Mechanics rolled away tool carts, and the bomber's engine sat silent but ready, looming like 4 massive promises of either survival or oblivion. Inside the fuselage, the men moved with practiced efficiency. Waist gunners inspected ammunition belts, making sure every .50 caliber round fed cleanly. The radio operator secured his station, tightening straps on equipment that might be thrown around during violent maneuvers. The navigator, Joe Sarnosky, quiet, precise, and one of the best photo recon men in the Pacific, calibrated the camera controls that would determine whether the entire mission mattered or not. Zeamer walked the length of the aircraft one last time, running his hand across the patched fuselage. Every improvised gun position, every reinforced bracket, every stripped-down panel was something he and his crew had built themselves. This plane was more than a tool. It was a declaration. Old 666 wasn't cursed. It was engineered to survive what others feared. One by one, the engines roared to life, each coughing at first before settling into a steady thunder that rolled across the field. Pilots from other crews looked up, some shaking their heads. Flying this mission alone was madness. Doing it in the squadron's most battered airframe seemed beyond logic. Yet the crew felt a strange confidence as the propellers blurred into motion. They trusted the guns. They trusted the modifications. And above all, they trusted Zeamer, who had a habit of bringing men home for missions no one else would attempt. With clearance from a tower, Old 666 rumbled forward, gaining speed along the runway. The bomber lifted into the humid morning air, climbing steadily toward the pink edge of sunrise. Below them, Port Moresby shrank into a patchwork of coastline and jungle. Ahead lay 1,200 miles of ocean and the deadliest airspace in the Pacific. There was no turning back now. Once Old 666 cleared the mountains north of Port Moresby, the world became nothing but sky and ocean. The rising sun cast a pale gold shimmer across the Solomon Sea, turning the waves below into a vast, rippling mirror. For the next several hours, there would be no landmarks, no radio chatter, no escorts. Only the constant drone of 4 Wright Cyclone engines and the steady vibration of the airframe. Inside the bomber, each man settled into the rhythm of long-range flight. The navigator monitored their dead reckoning calculations, careful to compensate for crosswinds that could push them off course into waters where search and rescue would never find them. The gunners stripped down their weapons and reassembled them again, ensuring no jams would ruin their chances in a fight. Ammunition cans were stacked neatly along the fuselage, hundreds of pounds of 50 caliber rounds ready for the moment they were needed. Zeamer sat high in the cockpit, eyes scanning the horizon. He kept the bomber low to avoid early detection, flying just above the scattered cloud deck. Every few minutes he adjusted the throttle, balancing speed, fuel consumption, and climb rate to hit Bougainville precisely at the planned time. Timing would determine everything. Arrive too early, and ground crews might not be active on the airstrip for the cameras. Arrive too late, and Japanese air patrols would already be in the sky. Despite the calm, tension slowly built in the cabin. Even the ocean seemed to change nature as the morning wore on. It wasn't simply empty. It felt isolating, a reminder that if anything went wrong, engine failure, enemy spotters, a forced landing, there would be no friendly shoreline to drift toward. Only miles of water and a slim hope of rescue. Yet the men found comfort in their preparation. Old 666 hummed with purpose. Every structural reinforcement, every custom gun mount, every modification they had made gave them confidence. They had built this bomber for the exact moment they were flying toward. As the sun climbed higher, clouds thinned, and far ahead, the faint outline of Bougainville began to rise out of the haze. The enemy coast was waiting. Bougainville appeared first as a dark streak against the horizon, then slowly grew into a massive spine of jungle-covered mountains rising out of the sea. The closer Old 666 came, the more detailed the island became. Coastal plains, river inlets, and finally the unmistakable geometric outline of a Japanese airfield carved into the landscape. Inside the bomber, the mood shifted. Conversations faded. Movements became sharper, more deliberate. This was the point of no return. Once they crossed the coastline, they would be within range of Japanese spotters, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter station at the base. Zeamer brought the plane higher, rising above 25,000 feet to get the best possible visibility and to force any interceptors to climb after them. At this altitude, the air thinned and the temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed on the metal surfaces inside the fuselage. Oxygen masks hissed with every breath. The bomber's crew felt the atmospheric pressure in their bones. Every heartbeat a little heavier, every movement a little slower. Sarnowski, positioned near the forward camera mount, double-checked the equipment that would define the mission's success. The target wasn't the airfield itself, but the Japanese expansion underway. New revetments, newly bulldozed runways, aircraft placements, fuel storage sites. Intelligence needed proof, and these photos would provide it. They reached their photographic altitude and began the approach run. The bomber leveled out, engines thundering at a steady pace as the lenses opened. Below them, Japanese personnel moved about the airstrip. Trucks crawled between hangars. Tiny specks, ground crews, walk along the runway. No alarms sounded. No guns fired. For a few tense minutes, old 666 was just another distant glint in the sky. But when the bomber completed its wide, circling maneuver, an unmistakable photo recon pattern, someone on the ground understood what was happening. Base sirens began to howl. Men scattered. Aircraft crews rushed toward their fighters. The first Zero engines roared to life. Old 666 had been spotted, and the interception was already underway. The sirens from the Bougainville airfield had barely begun to wail when ground crews rushed to pull away chocks and spin propellers on the waiting Zero fighters. Within moments, the first aircraft clawed into the air, engines screaming as they climbed toward the lone intruder. Old 666 continued its steady path, cameras still rolling, the bomber completing the critical final portion of its photographic circuit. Zeamer held the controls firm, resisting every instinct to break away. One turn too early, and the entire mission would be wasted. The cameras needed the full sweep, full clarity, full coverage of the expanding Japanese base. That meant staying exposed a little longer, long enough for the interceptors to close the distance. From the nose compartment, Sarnowski was the first to spot them, dark specks emerging from the coastline. At first only 2, then 4, then more behind them, rising in layered formation. The sight was almost surreal, a growing swarm of fighters, each one capable of shredding a bomber in minutes. The crew snapped into combat readiness. Waist gunners pulled back charging handles. The top turret rotated with a mechanical whine. Ammunition belts clattered into place. In the tail, the rear gunner steadied his breathing, lining up the tiny shapes rushing toward them. Old 660 SIXS cameras finished their last exposures. Sarnowski announced it. Mission objective complete. Only then did Zeamer shove the throttles forward, pushing the bomber into a slow but deliberate turn away from the airfield. It was too late to outrun the enemy. The Zeros had altitude. They had speed. They were diving now, sunlight flashing off their wings as they angled directly toward the bomber. Old 660 SIXS crew braced themselves. The ocean stretched endlessly below, the enemy island behind, and hundreds of miles of open sky stood between them and home. The first wave of Japanese fighters opened fire, and the longest sustained aerial battle of the Pacific was about to begin. The first burst of machine gun fire stitched across the nose of Old 666, ripping through metal and sending shards spiraling past the cockpit windows. The bomber shuddered but held its course. In the nose compartment, Sarnowski opened up with his .50 caliber gun, sending long, hammering bursts toward the incoming fighters. Tracers arced into the sky, creating bright lines against the morning light. The Japanese pilots came in disciplined waves. Zeros attacked from above, from the sides, and directly head-on, probing for weak points, testing the bomber's defenses. But Old 666 wasn't built like any standard B-17. The modifications made by Zeamer's crew now revealed their full purpose. From the top turret, the twin .50s roared in control volleys, keeping several fighters from pressing their attack. Waist gunners fired in overlapping arcs, creating a curtain of steel that forced the Zeros to break off or risk flying straight into a stream of heavy fire. The tail gunner tracked targets, diving from high angles, his weapons rattling the entire rear fuselage. The bomber wasn't simply defending, it was fighting back with a volume of fire the Japanese did not expect. The air around Old 666 flickered with gunfire flashes, smoke trails, and the thunder of engines pushed to their limits. Empty casings bounced across the fuselage floor like metallic rain. Still, the enemy kept coming. Their attacks grew tighter, more desperate. 1-0 Dove, so close that its propeller wash buffeted the bomber, nearly knocking a gunner off his feet. Another swept past the right wing, riddling it with holes before being torn apart by converging fire from two gun positions. Inside the aircraft, the temperature rose as gun barrels overheated. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled every compartment. Oxygen masks rasped as the men fought through the thin air at altitude. Every second felt stretched, every minute a battle in itself. Old 666 was absorbing hits. Metal screamed, rivets popped, but despite the damage, the bomber stayed aloft and kept returning fire with unwavering ferocity. Wave after wave, the Zeros attacked. Wave after wave, the men of Old 666 refused to break. The Japanese pilots shifted tactics. Realizing the bomber's waist guns created a deadly barrier, several Zeros coordinated a simultaneous head-on attack, a maneuver known to shred B-17 crews by striking the cockpit and nose, killing pilots, navigators, and bombardiers in seconds. At closing speeds, over 400 miles per hour, even a brief burst could be fatal. The first Zero came screaming in from 12 o'clock high, guns blazing. The canopy glass around Sarnosky exploded into glittering fragments. He stayed at his post, firing straight into the oncoming fighter. The .50 caliber tracers tore through the Zero's engine cowling, sending it smoking past the bomber in a downward spiral. But another fighter immediately took its place. Zeamer held the bomber steady. Any sudden movement would throw the gunners off or risk stalling the aircraft under heavy load. Bullets tore across the cockpit frame, punching through metal inches from his head. Instruments cracked. The oxygen line near his seat was severed. Yet he kept one hand on the controls, the other fumbling for emergency oxygen as he forced Old 666 through a shallow climb. Another fighter dove low, firing straight into the nose. Sarnosky was hit. Once, then again, shrapnel and bullets tearing into his side and legs. He collapsed to the floor, bleeding heavily. The nose compartment filled with smoke and freezing air, but there was no time to react. A third Zero lined up on its attack run. Despite his wounds, Sarnosky dragged himself upright. He braced against the gun mount, lifted the heavy weapon back into position, and fired. His round struck the incoming fighter squarely, ripping off a section of its wing. The Zero cartwheeled out of the sky, spinning toward the coastline. The effort cost him. With his strength gone, Sarnosky slumped against the bulkhead, his breathing shallow. Behind him, the open sky flashed with more incoming fighters. Bougainville's entire air contingent now committed to destroying the lone intruder. Word traveled through the aircraft. The nose gunner was gravely wounded, but the attacks were escalating. More fighters were climbing to join the assault, and the bomber's forward defenses were weakened. Yet Old 666 kept fighting. Every gunner was now pushing past exhaustion, firing into an endless storm of enemy aircraft. Every second they held on was another second earned in the sky. The battle was far from over. More Zeros were closing in. By mid-morning, Old 666 had become a living battlefield. Holes peppered the fuselage from nose to tail, and smoke curled from the wing roots where bullets had ignited hydraulic lines. The engines throbbed with strain, propellers slicing air over rivets that had already been stressed to their limit. Inside, the crew's faces were streaked with soot, sweat, and blood, but their eyes never left their stations. The Japanese pressed relentlessly. Fighters attacked from above, below, and head-on, often in coordinated groups. Every attempt to break formation brought heavy fire from the bomber's 19 guns. 1-0 collided with the bomber's port wingtip, sending a cascade of sparks and metal fragments down the fuselage. It tore away a section of the rudder, but Zeamer gritted his teeth and held steady. Losing altitude would expose them further. Climbing too fast risked engine failure. The balance between survival and control was razor thin. From the tail, the gunner fired continuously, his arms shaking with exhaustion as rounds emptied from belt after belt. The top turret barked incessantly, its twin barrels glowing red-hot, spitting fire into attackers attempting to dive on the bomber. Waist gunners alternated fire, covering each other in overlapping arcs. Each gunner's aim was a desperate calculation. One miss could mean the end, but one hit could save lives. Sarnosky, barely conscious, whispered coordinates into the radio for Zeamer and the bombardier to track. Despite his injuries, he reminded them where to fly for the quickest escape over the coastline. Every ounce of their training now counted. Instinct and muscle memory replaced thought. The sky itself seemed alive with chaos. Smoke trails from the Zeros painted jagged lines through the clouds. Explosions from near misses flung water and dirt skyward from the islands below. Tracers cut bright arcs through the blue, a deadly lattice that made every second feel like hours. Through it all, Zeamer's hands remained steady on the controls. The bomber shuddered under impact after impact, but stayed in the air. He pushed old 666 past normal limits, coaxing the battered engines and fragile airframe to hold together. Around him, his men continued firing, refusing to yield even as fatigue and injury clawed at them. In the Pacific skies that morning, no one had flown a mission like this. And yet, the battered B-17 held on. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Old 666, riddled with holes and bleeding hydraulic fluid, continued its grim march across the sky. Zeamer guided the bomber over treacherous terrain, following the coastline to avoid dense Japanese anti-aircraft concentrations. Every mile brought a new wave of fighters, each more desperate and aggressive than the last. 17 Zeros in the air at once, sometimes diving in coordinated strikes from multiple angles. Inside, the crew operated like a single organism. Each gunner anticipated the other's movements, covering blind spots, rotating belts, and shouting warnings when attackers lined up. The tail gunner and waist gunners synchronized fire to create lethal traps in the air. Sarnosky, weakened but determined, assisted the bombardier in relaying camera positions, ensuring that every critical photograph was preserved despite the chaos outside. The bomber took heavy damage. One engine began to falter, coughing smoke and sputtering intermittently. Rudder controls were partially jammed, and a large section of the left wing had been dented and torn by collision debris. Each maneuver required careful calculation. A wrong turn could stall the plane, sending it plunging into the sea below. Yet, against every prediction, old 666 survived. The 19 guns kept the fighters at bay long enough for Zeamer to maintain course. One by one, Zeros were shredded by concentrated bursts, their pilots forced into evasive maneuvers that often ended in flames and plummeting crashes. Every victory came at a cost. Gun barrels overheated, ammunition dwindled, and the crew's stamina reached the breaking point. The sound of engines, gunfire, and flak mixed into a continuous roar. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled the cabin. Hands blistered, fingers numb, and muscles screaming. The men of old 666 refused to yield. The Pacific sky had become a crucible, testing the limits of both human endurance and mechanical resilience. And still, the bomber pressed on, carrying 9 exhausted men ever closer to open water and the long flight home. After what seemed like an eternity, old 666 finally cleared Bougainville's immediate airspace. The Japanese fighters, running low on fuel and frustrated by the bomber's relentless defense, began to peel away. Some crashed from damage, others broke off entirely, leaving the bomber alone over hundreds of miles of open ocean. The crew barely had time to catch their breath. Sarnosky's wounds were severe. Others were exhausted, shaking from adrenaline and fatigue. The engines groaned under the strain of a plane heavily scarred but still airworthy. Zeamer adjusted altitude and course, aiming for the relative safety of Port Moresby's coastline hundreds of miles to the south. Despite the reprieve, danger remained. One engine still faltered, making the plane sluggish and difficult to control. Instruments were shot up, oil lines leaked. Every system was on the edge of failure. Even a small mistake could send Old 666 into a fatal descent. But Zeamer refused to let the bomber stall. Every decision was measured, every adjustment a gamble with survival. The crew worked in silence, conserving energy while maintaining the defensive watch. The tail and waist gunners stayed vigilant, scanning the sky for any straggler from the Japanese airfields. They knew that even a single late intercept could undo everything. Rounds were scarce, ammunition carefully counted, each shot deliberate. Hours passed, and the Pacific stretched endlessly below. Waves sparkled in the sun, a deceptive calm after the storm of combat. The crew's minds drifted briefly to home, to families and friends, but focus never wavered. Every member understood the fragile balance that had kept them alive. Old 666 pressed on. Every mile of water crossed was a testament to the plane's modifications and, more importantly, to the determination of the men inside. Against overwhelming odds, they were still in the air, still fighting, and still together. As the coast of New Guinea appeared on the horizon, a sense of relief mingled with disbelief inside Old 666. The battered bomber, scarred and smoking, had survived the impossible. Every gunner, every crew member had endured hours of unrelenting combat, returning fire against attackers who vastly outnumbered them. 19 guns had held 17 fighters at bay, and against all expectations, the bomber remained in the air. Zeamer guided Old 666 toward Port Moresby with painstaking care, carefully managing failing engines and compromised controls. The airfield came into view, and ground crews ran to clear the runway, witnessing the damaged aircraft limping home. Mechanics and fellow pilots stared in awe at the extent of the battle. The crumpled fuselage, shredded wingtips, and scorched engines told a story no report could fully capture. As the bomber touched down, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a shudder, the crew exhaled collectively. They had completed their mission, captured the crucial photographs, and survived what was immediately recognized as the longest aerial engagement in Pacific theater history. The photographs would provide intelligence of immense strategic value, and the bravery displayed would inspire every squadron that followed. Inside the aircraft, exhaustion gave way to quiet celebration. Men tended to wounds, removed spent ammunition, and finally allowed themselves the relief of survival. The plane that everyone had labeled cursed had proven its worth, not because of luck, but because of firepower, preparation, and an unwavering crew who refused to quit. Old 666 would fly again, its legend cemented in the annals of World War II. The mission of June 16, 1943, became a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the extraordinary lengths a determined crew could go to defy fate. Against impossible odds, 9 men in a battered B-17 had not only survived, they had rewritten what was considered possible in the skies of the Pacific. The curse was broken. The legend had begun.